Week 4. Getting dressed in ancient Greece. In many ways, clothing in ancient Greece was no big deal. Under many circumstances, a man could pass for well-dressed while wearing nothing but a thin film of olive oil and a smile. Even travellers seem sometimes to have been content with a broad-brimmed hat and a heavy hymaton travelling cloak, which doubled as his bedding. Horse riders, by the way, had a shorter riding cloak called a chlamys. However, in another way, clothing was a very big deal, because all clothes had to be laboriously woven by hand, and one reason why many Athenians were severely underdressed by modern standards is because this is what they could afford. If modern wardrobes had only hand-woven, tailor-made clothing, then most would be much smaller as well. Unsurprisingly, ancient Greeks were very attached to the few items of clothing which they possessed, and got very bitter about muggers who would attack late-night revellers returning home and make off with their cloaks. This is particularly true because most Greek clothing was homemade. Almost every Greek woman was expected to put in time at the loom, from Penelope, wife of the king of Ithaca, to Athenian prostitutes who wove clothes between customers. So, a Greek male who had lost his cloak would have to report home that many long hours of work had just been wasted. Much clothing was made of finely spun wool. Wool spun amorgos style was so fine as to be semi-transparent. However, the Greeks traded frequently with the Egyptians, so garments of linen were also common. Despite the preconception reinforced by paintings, statues, and film, most Greek clothing was not white. Women's clothes tended to be pastel shades, with a pale saffron colour being very popular, while unbleached off-white suited the poorer types. Richer individuals had purple patterns stained onto their garments. Earth and vegetable dyes were used, but as none of these, apart from purple, was colour-fast, clothes washed together tended to acquire the same hue. A really extravagant item had threads of silver or gold. The standard dress for both sexes was the chiton. Women wore a more comprehensive version, while a 5th century male wore his knee-length. Male Doric chitons may have been shorter than their Ionian equivalent. In either case, the chiton was basically a long rectangle of cloth, pinned at the shoulder, usually on one shoulder for men and both for women. The garment was then kirtled at the waist, which is to say it was held there by a belt, with plenty of slack on the top part. Since Greek clothing came without pockets, anything needed to be carried could simply be dropped down the front of the chiton. Money was too small and fiddly for this, so the average Athenian carried his loose change tucked like little sweets between his cheeks and gums. The Doric peplos was popular in some parts of Greece as women's clothing. This was again the basic rectangle of cloth, made into a tube about the body and pinned at the shoulders and the side. This was then bloused with a girdle, and often artfully arranged to give the cloth a wavy or frilled effect. Fringes were often added to the borders, and tapes and pins were used to create sleeves. Imaginative use of borders and pins, the pins were called fibulae and resembled large modern safety pins, could create a variety of styles. A very basic peplos, wound around the body and then slung over the shoulder, was worn by men, especially older men. Women often wore a cloak as well as a chiton, especially respectable women, venturing outside the protective bounds of the household, and for added modesty and warmth they might don a shawl as well. Footwear varied from light sandals, Persian slippers were an indoor favourite, to a sort of heavy open-toed boot. However, many Greeks were happy to go barefoot, and it seems some passed their entire lives without bothering to don footwear. Children wore a garment strung around their waist that acted as something between shorts and a nappy, or, just as often, wore nothing at all.